President Obama makes an all-out sales pitch for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But will Congress buy this sweeping trade deal? Let's talk about it with Gordon Chang, writer for Forbes.com, who covers China and Asia. He's also a contributor at the Daily Beast, and he's the author of The Coming Collapse of China. He joins us from New York. Well, the full text of the TPP has been released, thousands of pages. What's your reaction, Gordon?
Well, yeah, 6,000 pages. I haven't made it all the way through yet. Clearly there's a lot of stuff in here that is making people in Congress unhappy, but I think overall it is a good deal. And largely because this is a strategic deal, not just a trade one, because the issue is who's going to write the trade rules in Asia? Is it going to be the United States or is it going to be China? That's the choice that we have right now.
Now, China is not in this deal, right?
Right. Despite what Donald Trump said on Tuesday, no, China is not one of the 12 nations that are the initial group in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But this deal does contemplate that it could become bigger. So, for instance, you have countries in the region that have expressed interest in joining. And China has, at this point, not expressed that interest. But nonetheless, what it is doing is it's sponsoring the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, which is a competitor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
China was invited and declined. Why?
I think China decided that it could not join the negotiations because it could not meet the standards that people were then talking about. So, for instance, state enterprises would be under severe restrictions, and China's system is built on these state-owned companies. Also, there were other things in this deal that China felt that it probably could not meet, such as labor standards and maybe even the environmental standards it thought that it could not accept. So clearly, this was a deal which had standards that Beijing just felt it could not meet.
So both China and Trump are opposed.
Well, it's not only Trump. It's Rand Paul, as we learned on Tuesday. And before that, we heard Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. When she was Secretary of State, she was in favor of this deal. But candidate Clinton is not. And her opponent, Bernie Sanders, thinks that this is like the worst deal ever, maybe the worst deal since Second World War, maybe even before that. So, in politics, and especially in presidential politics, trade deals are death, so candidates run from them. But when they actually have to govern, it's a different story.
Will Congress approve it?
I think they will. I think that, Senator Hatch has some pretty serious objections to it. But this deal is not going to be renegotiated, despite what some in Congress would like. And I think that at the end of the day, it's going to be this issue of it's our deal or China's deal. And the United States does not want to be marginalized from trade flows in the most vital region in the world. So I think, it's going to sort of be like NAFTA. Everybody hated it at first, but then they realized there really was no practical alternative. And especially if we have, President Obama put his weight behind it, which I think he will push this, and either he'll bring it over the line or his successor will.
This is not exactly the kind of issue that's going to be talked about the following morning or on corners during the presidential campaign, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, most presidential campaigns are really going to be focused on domestic issues. And, we've heard this through both the Republican and the Democratic presidential debates. Foreign policy gets very, very little attention. Unless something really untoward happens, this is going to be fought over the issues that we've been hearing about, taxes and health care and other such things. Foreign policy probably is going to be second place, unless something happens bad in the South China Sea or Ukraine or the Middle East. And then, of course, all bets are off.
There's a division here, though, like Bush and Kasich, Christie all support the measure. Clinton opposes it, and so does Trump and Fiorina and Jindal and Huckabee. So it crosses party lines, right?
Well, it does. And certainly in a presidential campaign, you are not going to have candidates really align themselves with it because no one's had a real chance to think through the implications of everything that's in there. And also because important constituencies in the United States are not really going to be benefited from this. When you have a deal which has general benefits for all of Americans, but certain groups take hits, it's very hard in a campaign to support something like this. And so that's why I think you had Hillary Clinton, for instance, who probably does like this deal. And indeed, in the U.S. government right now, they're talking about if Clinton becomes president, she will support this, is the belief. And I think that that's really a notion that when you govern, you have to look at different things than when you campaign.
On a side note, while answering a question at Tuesday's debate on whether or not he supports Obama's decision to put special forces in Syria, Ben Carson said the Chinese are involved in the conflict there. Do you have any knowledge of that?
Yeah, that's a head scratcher. I mean, China is indirectly involved in Syria from a number of different perspectives. So, for instance, in the fall of 2013, at the height of the Civil War, Chinese and Russian vessels were sortying together in the Eastern Mediterranean as a warning to the U.S. and NATO. Also, we've seen North Korea involved in Syria in a big way, and probably the Chinese are helping the Iranians in the background with regard to the North Korean involvement. But this is really sort of in the background stuff. The main players right now are Iran, North Korea, and Russia, not China.
What's the controversy in the South China Seas? What's the Great Wall of Sand, and how serious is this?
Yeah, this is extremely serious. The Great Wall of Sand are islands that have been reclaimed, about 2,900 acres since December 2013. That name came from Admiral Harry Harris, who is the commander of U.S. Pacific Command. China believes that it owns the South China Sea, that it has sovereignty, but this is generally believed to be international water, and there are about 6 other claimants to the islands in the South China Sea. This is important for the United States because for more than 2 centuries, if we have had any consistent foreign policy, it has been the defense of freedom of navigation. And China, through its very expansive sovereignty claims, threatens that freedom. And that's why a couple weeks ago, we sent one of our destroyers close to 2 of China's reclaimed islands in order to assert our right to travel on international seas.
And Senator Rubio, I believe, supported the president, right, in that action.
And all of the candidates support the president in this action. Probably the most graphic was Governor Christie, my governor, saying on Tuesday that he's going to send Air Force One over China's reclaimed islands. That's not going to happen, even if we do have a President Christie. But nonetheless, this is something which is consistent American foreign policy. This goes back to almost post-colonial times, right after the revolution. So we're not going to give this up. And this is something where we have basically a zero-sum contest with Beijing because there are no off-ramps, at least in the long run, for either the United States or China over freedom of navigation in the South China Sea.
You're critical of the Chinese president's state visit to Washington. You didn't like the whole rigmarole, the whole state dinner. You didn't like you said it was bad diplomacy. Why?
Well, because, we can talk to the Chinese and we should talk to the Chinese, but this does not mean that we have to legitimize their political system. Xi Jinping came to Washington really not to come to terms with President Obama on anything important. He basically came for the 21-gun salute, the South Lawn welcoming ceremony, the state dinner in the East Room. And that was it, because those images were beamed back to China by China Central Television, the state broadcaster. And basically the way this was played, as other state visits have been played, as essentially the United States honoring the Communist Party. Xi Jinping came to the United States. Seattle was his most important stop because he wanted the support of American tech companies and others. Washington really was an afterthought for him.
Do you think Asia will be widely discussed in the presidential debates when it gets down to 2 candidates?
Probably not. I mean, really, this is going to be, I think, an issue of if something really bad happens in the South China Sea, yes, then of course it will dominate the conversation in final debates. But until that, I don't think so. Asia is a pretty complex topic. It's probably more complex than most other ones. And also it's a topic that is not known to the American public, like, for instance, healthcare or taxes. And so I think that probably this is going to stay off the debates. But, you know, this is sort of like trying to predict the future, and no one's really very good at that.
You think China might try to colonize North Korea?
I think that China doesn't want to get too involved in North Korea, but if there are going to be problems in the regime, and it looks like they're getting more serious in Pyongyang, then China is certainly going to send its military south across the border into North Korea for various purposes. First of all, it wants to make sure that its border is stable, but also it needs to make sure that the nukes in North Korea don't fall into the hands of South Korea. And also, Beijing does not want its complicity in North Korea's weapons programs to be brought to light in the international arena. So there are a lot of reasons why China is preparing to send its military there if something terrible occurs. China doesn't want to do it, but China will do it. And on the other side, the South Koreans will send their military north into North Korea as well if the regime falls apart. With all of the executions that have been occurring recently, perhaps 100 senior officials since Kim Jong-un took over in December 2011, and maybe 200 or 300 junior officials, things are really serious, I think, in Pyongyang right now.
You have said in the decades ahead, India is going to be the strong voice in Asia, not China. Why?
Well, there's a lot of reasons for it. First of all, they've got a much more vibrant economy right now. They're legitimately growing at about a 7.0% pace. China is probably down about 2.2% in reality. But really, this is an issue of demographics, because in 2022, or maybe even earlier, for the first time in recorded history, or at least 300 years, but probably for the first time in recorded history, India will become the most populous nation on earth. China will be relegated to second place. And after this crossover occurs, India's population takes off. It has what is called ideal demographics, and China starts to sink very fast. There's accelerated demographic decline in China right now. Chinese leaders have got to be worried about it because their growth from 1978 onward was propelled by what's called the demographic dividend, which is this extraordinary bulge in the workforce. Now the workforce is declining fast. It's being reduced by 3 million workers a year, and that's going to be very difficult for Chinese leaders to navigate against. So this demographic problem for China is only going to get more serious. It's going to help India, and so by the middle of the century, there's going to be about 600 million more Indians. If they can find work for those guys, this is going to be the big economic story of this century.
Thanks for your expertise today, Gordon. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Larry.